Okay, Fred Ehrsam.
Okay, thank you. Hey everybody, good to see many familiar faces out there. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about tokens. Why might somebody create one, and then how might somebody go about creating one? So brief background on me, as was just mentioned, co-founder of Coinbase along with Brian. I did computer science at Duke. I worked at Goldman, aka the Vampire Squid, for a little bit. And now I'm working on Coinbase, where our mission is to create an open financial system for the world. So a little while ago, I wrote this blog post, AppCoins and the Dawn of the Decentralized Business Model. So I'm going to talk about some of the concepts in that. I think one important note, I think the term AppCoin, which I obviously used in that post, is probably not the best term for what's being described here. I think like often when we think about an app, we usually think about some kind of end consumer product or interface. And I think one thing that maybe we'll get to in this, which is interesting, is I think what these tokens, or I think maybe the most proper name for these things are protocol tokens. That's ultimately what they really are. If you think about something like, I don't know, LinkedIn in the world right now, what is it? It's really a bundling of a network of people who are posting jobs and people who are seeking jobs, and an application, kind of this thin client or interface to access that network underneath it. So I'm going to try to not use the term AppCoins because I think it's worse, basically, and use the term token instead.
Did you guys do the recording?
What's up?
Screen recording?
Yeah, here we go.
Oh, I'm recording on the laptop. Yeah, no worries. So a couple key components to these things, and who knows, these things might change over time. This is just what we've observed so far. So what are the key components of these tokens? One, they're sort of the native token of whatever the underlying protocol or network is itself. Contributors, whether that be developers or users of the application, or maybe even other service providers, are paid natively in that token. And then the great thing is that since all this is on the blockchain, it's fungible to all sorts of other assets, including local currency through services like Coinbase. So examples we've seen in the world of this today and in the future, things like Augur's Rep or Filecoin or First Blood or Gnosis's upcoming tokens. I think one interesting thing about this is it feels like this whole sort of like token idea is new, but in many ways it's not, right? Like the OGs of this entire thing were Bitcoin, where you have this network of people looking to either store their wealth or do transactions. And the native token to that transactional network is a Bitcoin, or similar with Ethereum with the addition of the global computer idea. So I guess I just want to give a practical example of what something like this might look like. So again, I think if you look at the history of a lot of companies in Silicon Valley, they follow a very similar pattern in that they go and raise a bunch of money, and then they use that money to create some big network effect in the world. In the case of Uber, it would be connecting a bunch of riders with a bunch of drivers. With Twitter, it's a bunch of people who want to post updates with a bunch of people who want to read them. And you can kind of enumerate this for Facebook, LinkedIn, and on and on and on. And what they do once they've created this massive network effect in the world is, since they own it as a centralized company, they can extract rent on it forevermore. And it's their proprietary company who kind of can do that. And this is sort of the model, if you imagine Uber as this central kind of black suit with a series of customers, employees, service providers, et cetera, around the edge. So I think the really interesting thing about this idea of tokens in the world is you can basically just rip the centralized company right out from the middle of this network and replace it with a native token and the accompanying smart contracts, or maybe said more simply, software that lives natively on the blockchain. So no longer do you need this big centralized company to coordinate a network of people trying to achieve some kind of common goal in the world. In the case of Uber, let people request rides and then take rides somewhere. You can just do it through software on the blockchain. One way I like to think about this is, so when does it make sense to use this token model? I think the answer that I've landed on is if you're creating a network that's coordinating a bunch of people towards some common goal. Again, in the case of Uber, you're coordinating a bunch of riders and drivers to ultimately create an experience where somebody can tap a button and then take a ride somewhere. In other words, if you're creating a network effect in the world that coordinates different actors, the answer is, I think it makes sense for the token model. There are other things like very individual labor, like if you're like baking cupcakes in a physical store, there's not necessarily a network effect around that, so it probably makes a lot less sense for the token model to apply there. Going back to kind of what I was describing as like the typical sort of startup Silicon Valley model that we've seen repeated over and over and over, there is a very distinct chicken and the egg problem that occurs with these network effects, where if you're the first person to use the network effect hasn't gotten going yet, thus the value to you as a user is quite low. So imagine being the first user on Twitter, for example. If you go and write an update, it's like walking into an empty room, nobody's going to read it. So you have this chicken and egg problem of the more people that join the network, the more valuable the network becomes, the more people want to use it, et cetera. And it's sort of this snowballing thing, and this is what venture capitalists have been betting on for years and years and years. So this is just a basic graph describing that. You can imagine if you're user 1 on Twitter, nobody else is reading what you wrote, so why the heck are you here? Similar if you're reading content on it, there's nobody posting stuff. The other side of this is what you might think about as the equity potential for somebody who's joining a startup, right? If you're one of the first people to join a network or a startup, you get a much larger kind of ownership percentage of that network. So it provides this very strong incentive to join earlier. It's riskier, but if it works out, then you've done quite well for yourself. And you'll notice these two graphs are basically mirror opposites of each other. So when you put them together, you create this interesting and I think very important incentive structure in the world where now you've effectively incentivized all the people who you want to use or provide services to your network to join it very early on and basically take a bet on what you're creating in the world, right? And we see this through a lot of incentive structures today. Like for example, Uber will go raise a bunch of money and then give people massively discounted rides at the beginning to try to get this network effect going, or they'll give these big driver bonuses in new cities they might launch. So we're seeing this in the world today, but it's through this kind of this pass-through mechanism, if you will. And I think this effect would be a lot more powerful if you could basically extend the opportunity to be an early and mutual owner of a network to all the potential users of your protocol or application in the world. I think this begs 3 major questions if you're somebody who's interested in trying this model in the world in the same ways that Bitcoin and Ethereum and some of those other early projects are. And it's pretty early days on this stuff. So these are more ideas, and I'm sure they will morph quite a bit over time. So I think there are 3 main questions. The first is, how should we go about raising money to fund our project? The second is, how should we allocate and distribute those funds over time? And the third is, how should we structure an entity to handle the distribution of those funds? Okay, so the first one, how should we raise money to fund a project which has a native token? We've seen different models for this over time. Bitcoin had a model where some of the early developers just happened to mine a bunch of it, and that gave them a pretty good economic incentive to continue working on the thing. Ethereum did a pre-sale in Bitcoin, and now we're seeing new models on top of Ethereum, which I think are the most interesting, where there's a sort of a pre-sale through, actually that's not even a pre-sale, a sale through an Ethereum smart contract. You can break these into 2 general categories, pre-sales and post-release sales. So pre-sales means I need some money to go and create my idea to get to V1 of my protocol, and I want to collect money to do that now to fund the development, and it will be released later. I think these are, it makes a lot of sense why people would do this. It's equivalent to, in a startup, raising money before you've actually released a product. And then the post-release sales, I think, is what we're seeing largely through Ethereum smart contracts, where you can give the contract some Ether, and it will actually give you back the asset, the token, right away. I think one interesting thing about this is obviously the legality around it. And I guess also just like the ease for the set of developers who's creating one of these projects. So one thing I'm interested in seeing potentially for the future is more and more of these token sales going towards the Ethereum smart contract model that we're more commonly seeing. But I wonder if there's a way we can do it where you effectively just set up the token libraries, the basic ERC20 standard libraries for the token, that create them in the world, make them storable, sendable, receivable. But basically the rest of the protocol hasn't been built out yet. If you want to think about it as a software development project where it's modularized and the only module you have to start is the literal tokens themselves. So there's not this weird element of a pre-sale where you're sort of handing out this IOU in the world. You're actually getting what will be the future token. It just so happens that the rest of the software to govern the protocol hasn't been written yet. And I think that's potentially a lot cleaner and easier of a way to do it. Okay, so the second question, how should we allocate and distribute funds over time? I think this is an interesting question. And what we've seen, at least with models like Zcash, is it's more and more borrowing from the economic models we kind of know today from like a typical startup. So the reason I say Zcash is an interesting example is they have this idea basically of vesting over time built directly into the protocol that you might see in equity in kind of a startup. Typically what we're seeing in the world right now is, I actually have this inverted here. So normally people are withholding about 10 to 15% of the tokens that they're creating and selling 85-ish% of the tokens. It's interesting when you compare it to what you would think about a normal startup, where it's actually the exact inverse. So normally when you do an initial kind of funding of a startup, you retain 80% of like the tokens or the equity, and 20% is sold to like a first seed investor or whatever it might be. I'm not exactly sure how that will play out long term, but I think it's an interesting observation. There is, if you want to kind of make this analogous rather to kind of regular companies in the world, you can think about the proceeds, whether it's Ether or dollars, from the pre-sale as kind of like the cash that a company might raise, and then the tokens that they hold back as kind of like the options pool, more or less. One thing I think is interesting that we haven't seen a whole lot of yet in the world is, and this happens in companies and startups all the time, what happens when those initial funds from the initial fundraise run out, right? Like there's kind of this model of, at least so far, and these are all really early projects, of we just do one fundraise and hopefully that just funds the thing into perpetuity. I'm guessing that will not continue forever. With Ethereum, one of the main reasons it's worked so far is, just like a successful company, the Ether that the foundation holds have appreciated quite significantly in value, meaning that they can continue to pay for development more and more and more. So one thing I'm quite interested in is what happens in the future when those initial funds that we held back start running out and we want to continue funding the development of these protocols. I think there are two kind of like obvious or potential solutions for this. The first is that people who have built services on top of the protocol directly fund it. So this would be the equivalent of like Facebook or Google currently in the world putting money towards developing web standards that they've built on, because they have all these value-added services they're generating a lot of money from, so it's clearly worth their while. And in some ways, you could view the Bitcoin Foundation as a very early example of that. There are a bunch of Bitcoin companies who put some money into this Bitcoin Foundation who hypothetically is paying developers. The second is what happens in a normal company, which is an agreed upon dilution, basically, of everybody who is a token holder. So everybody says, yeah, it's worth it for us all to dilute ourselves a little bit. You generate some new tokens. Those tokens are then used to fund future development of the protocol, in the same way that when you would do a fundraise in a startup, you let's say you had an options pool of 10%, and over the course of some time, that options pool has been depleted, you would re-up that options pool to 10% again when you go out and do a new fundraise. I think the latter is probably, I think it's the most interesting and potentially the cleanest option. I think some of the terminology around it sounds scary, right? Like dilution, or you could almost view it as like a tax if you viewed this whole thing as like a governance system to like go and build roads, i.e. like go and improve kind of the protocol on top of which we're all building. But I think that will be something that, that we'll see in the future. Finally, how should we structure an entity to handle the distribution of funds? So the most common approach, and again, it's early days on these things, I think the most common approach we've seen so far is people setting up a Swiss foundation or a Delaware corporation to do these things. The purpose of these entities is to basically control the funds that have been raised during the initial token sale and make sure that it goes towards development of the protocol and that things go quite well. I think what's likely here is that this continues to go more and more decentralized. MakerDAO, I think, has a very early example of this, where there's not, I believe there's not a particular legal entity actually that controls the funds from the pre-sale. There's a multi-sig wallet effectively where a couple of the key core developers mutually vote on and decide how to allocate funds for the future development of the protocol. And you can take this one step further and imagine it being just a kind of proof of stake like or voting mechanism for all token holders on the blockchain. So every token holder might have a vote as to how the funds set aside for development should actually be dispersed to best develop the protocol over time. And you can imagine that just like people oftentimes will follow the recommendations of the Ethereum Foundation because they have kind of this track record of doing great things for the protocol, there probably will be this effect of there's probably some prominent people in the community and the vast majority of people will vote along with them, assuming that things continue to go well and they continue to advance the protocol. So yeah, I think in the end state of this world, we probably look a lot less like a bunch of big centralized companies owning these really big, powerful network effects in the world, whether that's the network effects that Google has around a lot of your information, or that Visa has potentially around merchant processors and consumers, or Uber with riders and drivers, whatever it is. I think in the future what we'll basically see is those central companies ripped out of the center of these networks and software governing all the different members of these networks, and everybody having mutual ownership of the networks that they use, whether they develop software on it or they're just a simple user of it. I'm trying to get this idea out there a little bit more in the world. This was a Wall Street Journal article or op-ed I wrote that was out, I think 2 days ago. My theory around this is that it's like there's a lot of unknowns in developing these things right now, so we see very few examples in the world currently. But my theory is that people will continually figure out how to better create this type of a business model, if you want to call it that. And much like early web apps or mobile apps, people will kind of figure out the basic building blocks and we'll get much more rapid iteration around this type of model in the future. Finally, we're hiring, obviously, so if you're passionate about making an open financial system for the world, come talk to me, or Linda, another one of the people on the Coinbase team is here as well. All right, thanks for your time.
Okay, a couple of questions, maybe. Please.
Hi, my name is Max. What do you think about the fact that the government potentially will be regulating crowd sales? So I've heard that they're looking into the DAO and all the other crowd sales that were out there. And I think it can create a problem. And Zcash, actually, they, as far as I know, they avoided this problem by raising money only from the accredited investors. But if you're doing a crowd sales and if you take money from the mere mortals, I think it can potentially create problems in the future.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on how the whole thing is positioned. So I think a really instructive example of this in the world today is something like Kickstarter, where they're taking pre-sales for this future product, and presumably we don't even really think about this problem because the thing you're getting is something you use, you think of as a utility more than an investment. So I think it really depends how these things are structured and ultimately used in the world. So for the example of Filecoin, I think about that as something where people, hopefully over time, are more using it to use and access this distributed file network, less about the fact that you happen to be able to also buy it and hold it as something that looks more like an investment. Yeah, obviously an unknown around this model, but that's my gut feeling.
Hi, I'm Mo. Thanks for letting me withdraw my ETC from Coinbase.
Yeah, no problem. For those in the audience, sorry that took a little while.
So I think there's a lot of excitement around Zcash, and I presume Coinbase has some interest in potentially, I don't know, I'm speculating here, the privacy aspects of Zcash. How would that work if you're facilitating a private transaction, even though you know who your customers are? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think the answer is there isn't a definitive answer at the moment. I mean, that's even true stepping back from Zcash to Bitcoin in the first place. The idea of an open transactional network for the world is in many ways not what we have today. And then you can go in, I guess the way I think about it is you can go into different degrees of what that looks like once you're in an open financial world. Yeah, I'm not sure I have much of an opinion of it beyond that, and I think it's something that we'll have to kind of mutually figure out as time goes on and these networks get more popular.
Okay, let's thank Fred.